Ever since I was little, I've had a passion for history, influenced in a large part by my grandfather's mutual love for it. Back then, I used to focus on the who, what, when, and where of history, but never really the why or the how until my junior year when my English teacher, Miss Duke, gave me a copy of The Daughter of Time by Josephine Tay. This novel is about an evil, child-murdering king, Richard III, who usurped the throne and killed his nephews to solidify his claim to it, and a modern-day detective's search for the truth. Over the course of the novel, the detective comes to realize that Richard III, in fact, did not kill his nephews, but the way history was told made it seem like he did. And that got me wondering, how could history change in such a way that something is completely false be accepted as the truth? But I did not have a term for this until I began to talk to Miss Sal. So how many of y'all have heard the term historiography? All right. I see a couple hands, mostly thesis people or my parents. Anyways, if you haven't heard the term before, it's basically the study of how history changes over time. If your parents have ever said, "Oh, we didn't learn that when we were in school," then you've experienced historiography firsthand. It's just different historians stressing different facts to create a different picture. Now, there's nothing wrong with this process. It shapes how we view all historical events. But I argue the change for historical figures does not occur in a vacuum. Instead, it occurs in something that I call my Remembrance Principle, which I created in an attempt to explain why the historiography of Richard III changes. It's made up of 4 points. First, there are prerequisite characteristics that influence the figure's remembrance. These can be things that off the bat induce a positive reaction or a negative reaction. Obviously, if it's a positive reaction, they're going to be remembered better and vice versa. Second, profitability. The historians writing the history aren't doing so with clean hands, and their biases are a factor of that. This can be something benign like confirmation bias, or it can be malicious like a historian actively pushing a specific interpretation to further their own ideological gains. Third, defensibility. Obviously, the more defensible somebody's actions are, the better they're going to be remembered. And fourth, societal change. The historiography of different people changes to reflect societal values at the time. To prove this, I looked at 4 different people: Western outlaw Billy the Kid, American President Herbert Hoover, Confederate General Robert E. Lee, and French Queen Marie Antoinette. But for the sake of this presentation, we're just going to look at Billy the Kid and Marie Antoinette. If you haven't heard of Billy the Kid, it's no big deal. He had no effect on global, American, or even New Mexican history, where he called his home. But for some reason, he has become an American folk hero, which is kind of strange since he only killed like 5 people. Anyways, all the original stuff published about him in the 1880s was negative. It was mostly newspaper articles reporting on his killings. And so obviously it was pushing a negative perspective because America did not appreciate some guy riding around the West shooting people up. It's just something really hard to defend, meeting my 3rd principle. However, following his death, a man named Patrick Garrett, who was actually his killer, published a book that, while condemning his actions, described some of the kid's likable qualities, which, while this did not immediately change the historiography, it kind of primed the pump for later interpretations. In the 1920s, a man named Walter Noble Burns published The Saga of Billy the Kid. And unlike Garrett's interpretation, which was a bad guy with good qualities, Burns took a radically different approach and said Billy the Kid was a great guy, robbed from the rich, gave to the poor. He was this Robin Hood-esque figure, a social bandit. And his interpretation sold, as creating this image of a monetary profitable Billy the Kid. As a testament to this profitability, Billy the Kid stayed in mainstream popular culture for the rest of the 1900s, appearing in books and movies and all that good stuff. He is actually the most depicted movie character of all time, if you did not know that. Anyways, more recently, around the turn of this century in the 2000s, he's begun to fade out of popular culture, which is why you probably haven't heard of him, because societal values have shifted in a way that made his actions and those that Westerns espouse hard to defend. The other person I looked at is French Queen Marie Antoinette. You probably have heard of her in the context of "let them eat cake," which she never actually said, and you only know because of historiography. Anyways, when she arrived in Austria in the 1700s, or when she arrived in France in the 1700s, she was an Austrian, and at that time, it would have been like Vladimir Putin coming to live in the United States. It was just a no-go. To make matters worse, France was also being ruled by an absolutist monarchy with high taxes and a slow economy. So the commoners weren't particularly happy either. So they did what the French always do, and they decided to revolt, hence the French Revolution. The revolutionaries pushed a very negative image of Marie Antoinette as a way of riling up their supporters to support their cause. And as the revolution commenced and continued, her image got worse and worse and worse until she was finally beheaded by the guillotine. However, her image became positive around 30 years later when the Bourbon monarchy returned to power in France during something called the Bourbon Restoration. And they pushed a positive image as a way of gaining historical legitimacy. Through the rest of the 19th century, her image waxed and waned between positive and negative depending who was in power, as a way of getting legitimacy and a way from benefiting from their telling. Obviously, if a monarchy was in power, positive; if a republic was in power, negative. More recently, a positive interpretation of Marie Antoinette's legacy has developed, with people acknowledging that she did not really have a lot of control over the situation she was in. She was just doing what queens did since the beginning of the French monarchy. She just happened to come to power at the wrong time. So why does this matter? Very few of us in this room will have volumes of biographies written on our lives, which will be subject to historiographical forces. But every one of us will leave a legacy, and every one of us will shape another's. History does not exist in a vacuum. We fill that space. As you leave this room, I urge you to realize the power you have over others' legacies. Be sure to approach it from all different angles and look at many different perspectives. And just remember, there's more to history than meets the eye.